Other nations fought for their freedom, seized their futures, and shaped their own destinies. But Puerto Rico was never given that chance. From the moment Columbus set foot on the island, it was doomed to be someone else's prize. The Spanish saw gold, sugar, and free labor. They took what they wanted, crushed the native people, and ruled with an iron grip for centuries. Then, just as Spain's hold was slipping, the Americans moved in, not as liberators, but as the new owners. They didn't ask, didn't bargain. They planted a flag, called it theirs, and set the rules. Puerto Ricans could fight and die in American wars, but they couldn't vote for the president who sent them. They were called citizens, but only when it suited Washington. And when the island tried to stand on its own, the U.S. made sure the chains stayed tight. The Jones Act, sold as a lifeline, turned into an anchor, draining the economy, jacking up prices, making survival a daily battle. And yet, every time the door to freedom cracks open, Puerto Rico stays. Is it fear? Generations of being told there's no escape? Or has the island been caught between victimhood and a system designed to keep it dependent? To understand where the island stands today, we have to look at how it got here in the first place. So Puerto Rico's story begins with theft. When the Spanish arrived in 1493, they didn't see a thriving land with its own people, culture, and way of life. They saw gold, they saw resources, and they saw an opportunity to strip the island down to nothing. The native Taíno people, who had lived on the land for centuries, were quickly enslaved, worked to death, or wiped out by disease. The Spanish dug deep into the island's soil, extracting every ounce of gold they could find, shipping it off to Europe while leaving the land and its people drained. But even after the gold was gone, Spain wasn't finished. Puerto Rico became a strategic military outpost, a colony meant to serve Spanish interests, not its own people. They built massive forts, brought in African slaves to work sugar plantations, and imposed a culture that blended with the remnants of the Taíno. But then in 1898, after losing the Spanish-American War, Spain handed the island over to the United States like a worn-out prize. No referendum, not even a choice, just a new flag waving over the fort Spain had built centuries earlier. So basically the chains didn't break. They just changed hands. But US came with a different plan. Because for the US, Puerto Rico was a huge military asset, a perfect launch pad for controlling the Caribbean, keeping an eye on Latin America, and projecting American power across the hemisphere. The island's people were never the priority. In 1917, the US granted Puerto Rican citizenship, but not out of kindness. It was wartime, and Washington needed more bodies to fight in World War I. Puerto Ricans were sent to the front lines. Yet back home, they had no right to vote for the president who sent them there. They were American enough to die for the flag, but not American enough to have a say in their own future. Economically, the US reshaped Puerto Rico to serve its interests. Locals went from running their own small farms to working for giant American sugar corporations that controlled the land. The island became dependent on imports, unable to develop its own economy because Washington never intended for it to stand on its own. Technically, Puerto Rico wasn't absorbed into the US family. It was locked in the backyard, close enough to be useful but never treated as an equal. And as time passed, the chains only tightened. One of the tightest chains, the one that keeps Puerto Rico struggling while pretending to protect it, is the Jones Act. When Congress passed it in 1920, they claimed it would strengthen America's maritime industry, ensure a strong merchant fleet, and protect national security. But like most things that sound good on paper, reality turned out to be a different story. The Jones Act requires that all goods shipped between U.S. ports be transported on American-built, American-owned, and American-crewed vessels. For Puerto Rico, this meant one thing: everything cost more. The island, which already depended on imports for most necessities, had to pay absurdly high prices for goods that could have been much cheaper if they were shipped directly from nearby countries. Instead of allowing Puerto Rico to trade freely, the law forces businesses and consumers to rely on an outdated, overpriced, and shrinking U.S. shipping industry. And surprisingly, the Jones Act didn't even achieve its own goals. The number of Jones Act-eligible ships has plummeted over the decades. The Jones Act fleet has dropped from around 250 ships in the 1980s to just 91 today. American shipbuilding is a shadow of what it once was, producing only a handful of vessels a year, while global shipbuilders in South Korea, Japan, and Europe dominate the industry. The law that was meant to strengthen America's maritime power has done the opposite, driving costs up, pushing companies away, and leaving Puerto Rico stuck with fewer options and higher bills. So, what's the alternative? Repealing the Jones Act is the obvious choice. Let Puerto Rico buy from whoever offers the best deal. Let businesses find cheaper shipping options. Let the island breathe. But if full repeal is too much for Washington to stomach, there are other solutions. The U.S. could invest in buying modern ships from allies like South Korea and Japan, nations that actually know how to build them efficiently. It could focus on training a reserve of American sailors to operate these ships when needed, ensuring national security without strangling the economy. The U.S. keeps Puerto Rico on a leash, but the Jones Act isn't just a leash, it's a noose. And unless it's loosened, Puerto Rico will keep paying the price for a policy that failed decades ago. But the Jones Act is just one example of how Puerto Rico is held back. The island's biggest chain isn't economic, it's political. For all the struggles, for all the second-class treatment, Puerto Rico has had chance after chance to break free. And yet, every time the question of independence comes up, the answer is the same: no. Since the U.S. took over, Puerto Rico has held multiple referendums on its political status. Should it be independent? Should it become a full-fledged state? Or should it stay in the awkward, frustrating limbo of being a U.S. territory? Time and time again, voters have chosen to remain attached to the U.S., even though that attachment comes with more restrictions than benefits. So why stay? Because the alternative is terrifying. Independence means losing U.S. federal funding, military protection, and citizenship. Full statehood, on the other hand, is a distant dream, one that Congress has never taken seriously. Puerto Rico is trapped in an identity crisis. And for all the frustration with its status, Puerto Rico remains in the same place, stuck. Not fully part of the U.S., not fully independent, and not making real progress toward either. The fear of breaking away is understandable. Independence means uncertainty, while statehood feels like an impossible dream. But staying in this halfway house of territorial limbo isn't working either. The island is bleeding talent, losing economic opportunities, and watching itself decay under restrictions that benefit no one except bureaucrats and politicians who thrive on stagnation. The truth is, Puerto Rico's biggest enemy isn't just the U.S. government. It's its own inability to take control of its future. Corruption is rampant, local leadership is often weak, and a culture of dependence has made real reform nearly impossible. But that doesn't mean the island is doomed. Change is possible if the right moves are made. One of the most obvious changes would be economic reform. The Jones Act has suffocated Puerto Rico's ability to trade freely, but repealing it is just one part of the equation. The island needs a new approach to economic survival, one that focuses on strengthening industries beyond tourism and manufacturing. Building a competitive maritime economy, investing in alternative energy, and creating tax incentives for global businesses could transform Puerto Rico into an economic powerhouse instead of a welfare state. Then there's the question of status. Independence might sound bold and liberating, but would Puerto Rico actually survive on its own? The island relies heavily on federal aid, and without the U.S. safety net, it could struggle even more than it already does. On the other hand, remaining a territory with no voting power is a dead end. Some argue that pushing harder for statehood is the only real path forward, but that would require a level of political pressure that Puerto Rico has never successfully applied. One thing undoubtedly true is that staying on the current path will only lead to more decay. Puerto Rico is like a ship lost at sea, too afraid to cut the rope tying it to a sinking vessel, yet unwilling to row towards solid ground. Independence could mean rough waters, statehood remains a mirage on the horizon, and half measures have only left the island drifting further into decline. But at some point, a choice has to be made. Because the worst fate isn't capsizing in the storm, it's slowly rotting away, forgotten, in the dead calm of indecision.